Okay, as we're trickling back in, on this talk, I'll be discussing the divine institution of the nation of Israel. There are some technical terms in there that we'll discuss. As mentioned earlier, we've got four different speakers this weekend, and we are all in fundamental agreement on this topic, but we have a few different vocabulary words here and there, so we can clarify a few things moving forward. But first, a little bit about me. I was raised in a Christian environment. I was very active in the youth group when I was a youth, and I was very interested in spiritual things. Unfortunately, it was the Bible Belt. I was from Texas originally, you could say. Um, and at that time, in that place, church was really more of a social club, an opportunity to get a lot of people together and have fun. And a lot of people got saved through the youth ministries and stuff that I was a part of. Unfortunately, it wasn't a very Bible teaching environment. Our youth pastor liked to say kids only care about three things: sex, the future, and whether or not there is sex in the future. And that right there, that it would solicit giggles, right? Because he said sex. The thing is, though, that we had a lot more on our mind than sex, the future, and whether or not there was sex in the future. And I came to the conclusion, after being exposed to that form of Christianity, that Christianity is just an empty religion that doesn't have any questions to life other than don't have sex. So I abandoned Christianity in my late teens. I joined the Texas National Guard the semester before I graduated. I graduated a semester early from high school. That was 2001. So September 11th occurred, and before long I found myself in Iraq without a consistent worldview to describe the evils that was going on around me. So I spent a year out there as an infantryman. Saw some cool stuff, by the way. This is a picture of Ur of the Chaldees of biblical significance. That's the Euphrates River. I was a very outspoken critic of Christianity. I was an apologist trying to get people away from that religion that I thought was so terrible, and I regret every success that I had. But even then, I recognize the significance of, this is So I got out of that, came back to America, and had a hard time adjusting back to society. I lived a crazy life. I lived a very stupid life without any kind of worldview. So before long, I found myself in federal prison. My friends and I were having the hobby of making little pipe bombs and blowing stuff up around town. We blew up a statue of the Virgin Mary at a local Catholic church. Had a couple dozen marijuana plants in my closet, some pipe bombs, and a couple hallucinogenic mushroom cultivations when the police came in, and it turns out that's illegal, as well it should be. So I went to federal prison. Along the way, I noticed in prison we have a saying. We say, if it weren't for snitches, the feds would go out of business. That is to say that the way that the police operate is they'll arrest a group of people and they'll say, look, you're all about to go to prison, and whichever one of you snitches and gives us the most information will spend the least amount of time in prison. I was there because of snitches. Everyone around me was there because of snitches. Or they themselves were snitching, trying to reduce their time. This is the way the criminals work. Around this time, some Christians sent me some works on apologetics. And it turns out that my opinion had been that this Jesus guy was dead, buried, and end of story. He did not come back. However, his closest friends went out and told people that they saw the resurrected Christ. Now, my opinion was that they had made up that story. However, we know historically that they were arrested, tortured, killed, imprisoned. All they had to do to get out of that was say what happened to the body, but they stuck to their story. This is not the way that criminals work. Conspiracies do not work. Criminals will snitch to save themselves a little bit of time, much more so to save themselves from death. So the only rational conclusion I could come to was that Christ was indeed resurrected. And once you make that logical step, a whole lot of dominoes start falling into place. So I started studying systematic theology, and people were sending in books on theology, and I realized, oh my goodness, this Christianity thing is legit. It's not that weird zombie religion I thought it was. This is a holistic worldview. So I decided whenever I was in there that as soon as I got out, I wanted to spend the rest of my life helping other people see Christianity as a holistic worldview so they can understand who Christ was and they could believe in him for eternal life and go further of building a holistic idea and understanding of who God is and what we're supposed to do here on earth. So once I got out, I went to the University of Texas at Arlington. I was faced with the question, how am I going to do this? Do I want to be a pastor or a missionary, a theologian? And I said, well, when I was in Iraq, I was one of the better Arabic speakers in my unit, and I'm not a picky eater. And if you're good with languages and you're not a picky eater, you should be a missionary. So I went to UT Arlington, got a degree in Russian. Then I moved to Ukraine. I wanted to be a missionary, so I became an immigrant first. I went to the Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary and got a master's degree. Then to Tyndale Theological Seminary, same place that Jeremy went, and got a doctorate of ministry in Bible and theology. So I moved to Kyiv, Ukraine in 2011. Through a little Google searching, I found the same basic crowd that Andy and Dane and Jeremy are running in. And there was a group in Kyiv affiliated with the rest of us that had a nice little Bible college and a church affiliated with it with good theology. So I said, okay, I'll move out there. There's a college. Other people want to be in ministry, and we'll figure out what to do from there. That's where I met my lovely wife, Lena. We fell in love and got married and all that mushy stuff. And I was working a secular job in downtown Kyiv. And before long, my commute to work started looking like this. Does anyone remember this sort of imagery? Does anyone remember when this was? So it was 2014. We had a revolution in Kyiv, around the whole entire country of Ukraine actually, to oust the puppet of Putin, who was Viktor Yanukovych. I saw Vice President Biden come to Ukraine, and back in the Clinton era, America and Ukraine and Russia and the UK entered into a treaty whereby if Ukraine would surrender her nukes, then the three other powers would protect Ukraine if there was ever a threat. Russia invaded Ukraine at a moment of weakness during the revolution, so they're out. Then Biden came to say that he would not be honoring the Clinton treaty on the grounds that Ukraine is corrupt. And there's truth to that. Ukraine struggles with corruption, as any country does after Russian hegemony. It's worth noting that of all of America's allies, Ukraine has paid the highest price to get out of corruption. And it's also interesting that a few weeks later, Biden's son was involved in a corruption scandal in Ukraine, and none of the Western media outlets talked about it. Russian propaganda was going nuts, and I talked about it in the West, and people looked at me like, what? And then they found out a way to pin that on Trump somehow. Still haven't figured that out. We'll talk a little bit more about some of that in the session on Russia, though. At any rate, in 2016, my wife and I started Grace Abroad Ministries to promote theologically sound materials in theology through translation, teaching, and outreach. That's our son, Oliver. It's an older picture. There's no photographic evidence that the three of us have ever looked in the same direction at the same time. In 2021, we said we need to go to America. Our son is about to start school here in a bit, and that's going to change our life significantly. So we said, let's come to America for 6 months to raise support, and then we'll go back. So we came on August 31st, 2021, with a return ticket for February 14th, 2022. In theory, if you fly on a holiday, you get less people around you. That's cool. Unfortunately, the flight returned was canceled. The Russian soldiers were gathering on the border with Ukraine, as they had done earlier that spring. Not a lot of people know about this, but earlier in spring 2021, Russia gathered troops on the border, sort of testing out the new leaders of NATO after the American election. And Biden sent some boats to the Black Sea, and that settled it. But then after the absolute disaster of the pullout of Afghanistan, America displayed weakness. Nothing provokes Putin more than weakness. So whenever you hear of people provoking Putin, if they're speaking of weakness, then they're right. If they're speaking of standing up to him, then they're wrong. We'll talk more about that later. At any rate, the return ticket was canceled for February 14th, 2022. On February 24th, Putin escalated the war with an attempted blitzkrieg on our home in Kiev, resulting in the mass murder of civilians across northern Ukraine, which was eventually driven out because the Russian military is garbage and cannot stand to a bunch of redneck Ukrainian farmer boys. However, they have had a lot of success in the southern regions, not as much as they've wanted. They've murdered a lot of evangelicals out there. Here are the bodies. I've covered up the face, but this is the dean of the Kiev Evangelical Seminary who was murdered in the name of Russian unity. We'll talk about the ideology a bit more later. At any rate, we've been displaced to America. We've been cut adrift ever since the escalation. So here I am. My contribution to the war effort, I'm working on a PhD now in applied apologetics through the University of Liberty University. I'm doing a dissertation talking about the divine institutions as a metric for having an orthodox view of politics, which should suffice to refute not only the wokeism that we're seeing here rampant in the West, but also the Russist ideology of the East. And we'll talk about that more in the next session. For now, we're talking about the divine institution of the nation of Israel. I'm going to pass around a sign-up sheet. We send out an email every month or so to let people know what's going on in our life and ministry. If you're interested, put down your name and your email address, and I'll add you to our mailing list. Okay, so divine institution of the nation of Israel. Let's take a look at some quotes from around church history to determine what it is that we're dealing with here. You may be familiar with John Chrysostom, 4th, 5th century saint who wrote several volumes that have been very influential on church history since then. He wrote a book entitled Against the Jews, in which he says such things as, "And so it is that we must hate both them," the Jews, "and their synagogue, all the more, because of their offensive treatment of these holy men." He says such things as though such beasts as Jews are unfit for work, they are fit for killing. And this is what happened to the Jews. While they were making themselves unfit for work, they grew fit for slaughter. "This is why I hate the Jews." Blah, 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 blah. Of course, this is earlier in church history. We get into the age of the Reformation. Are you able to make out what's going on in this picture? This is the Wittenberg Church, built 1300 to 1470, and there's a despicable monument here of Judensau, which is Jew pig. There's an interesting dissertation I'd recommend looking up if you ever have the chance, called The Beast Between Us. It wasn't written by a Christian, but it documents very well the verbiage that has developed in Christendom to describe Jews as animals. This is the sort of thing that we're seeing, for example. Martin Luther, the reformer, describes what's happening in that despicable image. Here in Wittenberg, our parish church, there is a sow carved into the stone under which lies young pigs and Jews who are sucking. Behind the sow stands a rabbi who is lifting up the right leg of the sow, raises behind the sow, bows down, and looks with great effort into the Talmud under the sow, as if he wanted to read or see something most difficult and acceptable. No doubt they gained their Simchasaurus from that place. Of course, Martin Luther wrote a volume called On the Jews and Their Lies, which, if you look at the cover and the inside, you'll see very similar Judenschau imagery throughout the text. He says very extreme anti-Semitic rants coming out of the great reformer. Later on, you get to the trials after the Holocaust, and several of the Germans were citing Luther as support of we were doing the right thing. That's what the Christianity teaches, right? And of course, this is not restricted to the 21st century. More recently, especially after the October 7th attacks against Israel, we're seeing an increase of anti-Semitic posts and memes and sentiments coming out on social media, both on Western sources like Facebook as well as Russian Telegram channels. We're noticing an extreme uptick of anti-Semitic sentiments going on in the West. It's interesting that during all of this, Russia has been overwhelmingly supportive of Israel's enemies. Ukraine has been overwhelmingly supportive of Israel, which makes the whole Ukrainian Nazi thing just absolutely absurd. For crying out loud, they've got a Jewish president who had a majority vote. We haven't had a majority vote in America in favor of a president for quite some time, right? So we're in a situation today where we have a whole lot of anti-Semitism. What does the Bible have to say about it? So in this session, I'd like to take a look, first of all, an overview of what we have discussed so far regarding divine institutions. Then we're going to look at the divine institution of the nation of Israel. Where did Israel come from? And what did God put Israel here to do? Then we're going to look at two errors that people have made regarding Israel. Oh, and by the way, if y'all are interested, I'm not stingy with my slides at all. I'm going to hand them over to Dane afterwards, and he'll upload them to the site so you can download all this stuff if you'd like to look. I see some cameras coming out trying to take pictures of a screen, and I know how hard that can be because I'm kind of a notorious screenshot taker in the middle of sermons too. So the two myths about Israel that we're going to look at are, first, this false idea that Israel disappeared somehow during the exile in Assyria. That is false. We can prove that is false biblically. And then second is the notion that somehow or another Jesus did away with Israel, that Israel is no longer part of God's plan. God does not have a future for Israel. Rather, the church is the fulfillment of everything that God promised to Israel. That is essentially the framework that is the basis for statements that we saw just now from Chrysostom and Martin Luther and others. Okay, so overview so far. If you'll ask three dispensationalists what a divine institution is, you'll get about 5 or 6 answers. Here's the official definition from Paul Miles from the current literature review process that I'm doing. It's likely to be tweaked a little bit in the future with no significant diversions from what we have here. All right, so what's the definition? Divine institutions are absolute social structures which have been designed by God for the benefit of mankind, both believers and unbelievers alike. The divine institutions are the responsible individual, marriage, family, civil government, distinct countries, and the nation of Israel. We've discussed 5 of these so far. The responsible individual, marriage, and family we see created on which day of creation? I'll give you a hint. It's more than 5 and less than 7. 6, right? Day 6. When God created Adam, he gave him certain mandates, putting responsibility on him individually. And then He looks around and says, Lo Tov, it is not good that man is alone, so he creates Eve, and at the end of the day, it is Tov, it is good. Okay, this makes up the fabric of society, right? The individual as a responsible entity, and marriage and family as the productive basic unit of society. The way in which these are most frequently under attack today is by trying to dissolve the individual into the collective and to dissolve marriage and family into a village-based responsibility or a greater entity than that. Okay. Next, we have civil government, which comes out of the Noahic covenant. Then we have distinct countries and the nation of Israel. Okay. Just like in order to understand the family, you need to understand marriage. In order to understand the nation of Israel, you kind of need to understand distinct countries. So let's get into that. All right. Now notice, we're calling this the divine institution of the nation of Israel. And the other one was distinct countries. I'm using a very specific verbiage here. The word nation is notoriously difficult to define. Sometimes we use nation and country interchangeably, and that's okay. Sometimes in literature, you'll see the term nation being used in reference to a people group, while a country is more of an organization that includes three components. It includes a territory with specific boundaries. It includes a civil government that is in authority over the population of that boundary. Okay, that would be a country. The nation is a people group. Okay, so whenever I talk about the nation of Israel, I'm not only saying the modern country of Israel in the Middle East. I've had some anti-Semites say, "Oh, the nation of Israel only came about in, the 20th century." No, it did not. Right? The country was recognized, but the people group of Israel, the collective Jews around the entire world, ever since Abraham, right? That is the nation. Okie dokie. All right. So, the basis for civil government is found right here in the Noahic covenant. Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man, from the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. Okay, we saw this earlier with what Jeremy was talking about, how a lot of this is rooted very much in the image of God. We are image of God bearers. So if someone is to murder a man who carries God's image, that man is to be put to death. That's a capital crime, right? And who is it that is supposed to do this? Other men, right? So we have accountability before each other. After the fall, Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and presumably they had the conscience, the knowledge of good and evil, as the guiding principle for life in the dispensation after the Garden of Eden, right? Everybody was doing what was right in his own eyes. Have you ever heard anyone say, you do what's right for you, I'll do what's right for me? Morality is, subjective and fluid. I'm okay, you're okay. If it's true for you, it's true for you. They call that postmodernism. I say that's pre-Noahism. That's not a new idea, okay? That didn't come about after modernism. That came before the flood, okay? The result of that was debauchery, and the world had to be wiped out. So after that, instead of man looking after himself, now we have man looking over each other. But there's also the command that you need to go out and fill the earth, right? And so that's what they do. They watch over each other. They fill the whole entire earth. No hiccups or anything, right? Everything is peachy, right? Wrong. They rebel. They say, no, we're not going to go out. We're going to stand here and build a nice little tower, make a name for ourselves. lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth the way that God wants. And so God interrupts that. The Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth. The instrument which he used to do that was the confusion of languages. And we've had some linguistic discussions already, and that's always a fun topic. And if you're interested in meta-hermeneutics and the basis of how human language works as a basis for understanding the Bible, pick up Volume 2 of Grace and Truth at the book table in the back. Now, the languages continue to develop from that day all the way to today. Looking around, some of you are probably old enough to remember when the English word text was a noun, but now it is a verb, right? Language is constantly evolving. That would be one small little adjustment that we've had here in English. We also see in the book of Genesis, within a few generations after this occurring, we have Jacob and Laban speaking to each other. And we have all this written out in Hebrew. But it turns out that Laban is also an Aramaic speaker. When we think of the Aramaic Bible, we typically think of Daniel and Ezra and the Achaemenid Empire and the Babylonian Empire in those days. That was Imperial Aramaic, but there's also a very early Archaic Aramaic, which we have like 2 words of in Genesis, right? So very early on, we see language being used within the same family. By the time we get to Joseph, so one generation further, we have Joseph who's able to understand Egyptian, while his brothers do not, right? So language was an instrument that initially pushed people out, but that in and of itself is not the deciding factor of what a nation or a country is, right? There's a tendency for a nation to have a common language, but it's not necessarily true that a whole nation only speaks one language. Certainly isn't true that a single country must speak a single language. You go to India. I have several friends from India that just speak all sorts of crazy languages, and they might speak English with another Indian here if they see one in America. And if they see one out in India, they might speak Hindi as kind of a common language. And if they get to chit-chatting, they might find out, oh, you speak the same language that my mother speaks that I spoke in my house the whole time. And they'll start speaking that, right? So the confusion of languages keeps going on and on and on and on and on, the development therein. So while all that's going on, we get several people groups coming out of that, and they go around the world, and they're listed by families in chapter 10, the Table of Nations, we would call it. So that happens in chapter 11. You go to chapter 12, which is right after chapter 11. In fact, you might use a outline of Genesis that actually starts the new section in chapter 11. So arguably, this could very well be re-headed underneath the chapter that we see the same content going on in chapter 11. The chapters are not inspired, the text is. And God picks out a specific individual. Now the Lord said to Abraham, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great. You shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, returning to our sine qua non of a divine institution. Remember how a divine institution is there for the benefit of mankind, believer and unbeliever alike. God does not say, I will bless the believers who bless you, and I will curse the unbelievers who curse you. No, he says, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. So based on the Abrahamic covenant, I think we are justified in saying that Israel is there for the blessing of the world. In a very similar form, we can see it there. And as we move forward, I think we'll see some progression. Okay, now, remember we have distinct countries and the nation of Israel, a country having 3 elements: lands within a border, the people inside, and the civil government over the country. The nation of Israel is a people group. It's the descendants of Jacob. We have Jews all over the world right now. Regardless of where the Jews are, they remain part of the nation of Israel. Whether or not they have a country to call their own, no matter what century it is, the nation of Israel, not just the country, is the divine institution. So, what is a basis for making some of these claims? If we go to Deuteronomy 32:8, we see the following. God is describing what happened at the Tower of Babel incident. He said, when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, right? When he separated the sons of Adam, he set boundaries to the people. What event is being referenced here? When did God divide the inheritance to the nations? When did he separate the sons of Adam? This is the Tower of Babel, right? Everyone wanted to gather, so God scattered them abroad. That's what's being referenced here. Okay, what did he do? It says he set boundaries of the people. So this is where creation science comes into play. By show of hands, do we have anyone who is particularly decided one way or the other on the debate about the age of the universe? Any of y'all, like me, people who believe that the Earth was created fairly recently, 6,000 to 10,000 years ago? Okay. Anyone who would say, no, the Earth is a lot older, we should read the introduction of Genesis a little bit differently to see a long time there? Anyone kind of in the middle, I don't really know if it's old or young category? Okay. So a few uncertain, a few who would be more of an old Earth model. You don't necessarily need to believe by any chance that the Earth is young to be a faithful believer in Christ. However, if we do take a literal approach to saying that the Earth was created in a week and that the Earth was flooded in a global sense, that global flood can give us some insight to what was happening here in Deuteronomy 7:8 about the setting of the boundaries of the people. Assuming that the flood was indeed global, which I think is the biblical implication, it's likely that we had an ice age shortly after the flood. As the flood took place, it wasn't just a matter of rain coming down, but the fountains of the great deep opened up. We have reason to believe that there was a lot of catastrophic plate tectonic activity as plates moved around. A lot of volcanic activity as magma from down below started coming up into the oceans. I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding. Okay, this is good. We're familiar with creation science. Well, what happens as we get magma entering the oceans? Well, the water warms up. And what happens when the water warms up? The water evaporates. And then it goes up and drifts up as clouds. And as that happens, it starts to reflect the light coming in from the sun, which would cause global cooling as a result of the heating of the oceans. It's a little counterintuitive to think that more volcanic activity would cause things to cool off, but it very well could if it would cause the clouds. This is why we often hear people speaking of the potential nuclear winter that would happen if, in theory, a bunch of nuclear bombs went off. It could cause things to cool down as the sky gets blotted out. Okay, so that's happening, and that would cause an increased precipitation. It would be cold. That would cause a lot of increased snow on the Earth. It would cause a lot more ice. Here is a graphic from that perspective, basically, saying as we got more ice, it would cause the water levels to decrease. One of the problems that people are concerned about with climate change, specifically global warming, is that it would cause the ice to melt and cause the water to increase. Well, the opposite is also true. More ice means lower water. That would imply more land bridges between continents and islands and whatnot. According to one model, we could put the ice age as beginning right around the time of the Tower of Babel. Okay, so what would that mean? Well, as we saw in Deuteronomy 32:8, it was during the scattering of the people that we start to get boundaries put in place. Okay, so God scatters the sons of Adam. He causes weather patterns to happen that would have increased land bridges and capabilities for traveling around. Y'all are from Washington. You might recognize this thing, so I won't try any of my tricks. Whenever I teach creationism in Hungary, I like to ask, okay, who thinks this is 30 million years old? And I get some hands. And who thinks it's only 6,000? And I get some hands. I'm like, no, this was like the Mount St. Helens explosion. We can see from local catastrophes that whenever we have mudslides and volcanic activity, we can have very rapid sedimentation, erosion, recovery, and incorrect complexity, right? So a lot of this kind of activity could have been happening around the time of the Ice Age. Phenomena like the Grand Canyon could have formed as the ground was still somewhat soft, as we see ice beginning to melt, causing giant mudslides. So very rapidly, a lot of barriers could be cut out of the ground as God scatters people. It's also possible that we have mountains still forming. Of course, in middle school, they probably told you that the Himalayas and the Rocky Mountains are all pointy and jaggedy, while the Ouachita and the Appalachian Mountains are all smooth. Why do they say that in school? Well, they say because the Ouachita Mountains are older than the Himalayas. And if you look at the rock layers are legitimate. I might disagree with the dating, but the Ouachita Mountains are in the Paleozoic era, while the Himalayas are up here in the Cenozoic era. So they would say, well, this was 50 million years ago, this was 350 million years ago. However, if we take a flood geology, there's a lot of debate within creationist communities about geological columns, which ones were put there by the flood, which ones were cut after, which were before. I attended a 4-hour-long debate on the matter last year. It was tiresome. But I tend to think that some of the best creationists I kind of agree with in saying that the KPG boundary right about here is the flood barrier. That would imply that the Ouachita Mountains are smooth and curvy because they were formed under the floodwaters, where they were able to erode a lot faster, whereas the Himalayas are the result of colliding plates, which would have come after the flood, i.e., around the time of the scattering of the Tower of Babel, right? So let's pull all this together. So taking Deuteronomy 32:8 and applying it to the Tower of Babel with a recent creationism perspective, it turns out that after the flood, we could have an ice age, and the ice age could cut the land up. It could be a time when mountains are coming up. So when God set the boundaries of the people, he could have done that very realistically within the time frame that we're looking at. Isn't it interesting that whenever we look across the entire planet, what are pagans doing over the course of antiquity all the way up to Middle Ages? Well, they're going out and they're building giant towers, right? Well, that would kind of be expected if we had a dispersion after the Tower of Babel, that pagans would continue trying to do what they did there, but everywhere else. By the way, if I'm right here, this wouldn't be the only time that God has used weather and climate in order to work his purpose with nations. There is some scientific research, you can look up at the links right there, about the potential of climate change being a contributing factor to the rise and fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. From an atheistic perspective, that's just a big coinkydink. But from a biblicist perspective, God, who's able to control the climate, could have used that as an instrument to rise up people for the disciplining of Israel. Okay, so when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, he separated the sons of Adam. He set the boundaries of the people. Okay, very good. So we have boundaries for people groups around the world. What does that have to do with Israel? Well, the next part of the verse says, apparently he did this according to the number of the children of Israel. When God did that, he did this with Israel specifically in mind when he set the geological phenomenon around us that we have been using for borders ever since. Now, there is a textual variant. The Masoretic text, which I think is the most reliable Hebrew text, has according to the number of the children of Israel. Some people like to point out, especially more liberal theologians who like to attack the Hebrew Bible with everything they can. Some have pointed out that the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament, has according to the number of the angels of God instead of children of Israel. Dead Sea Scrolls has according to the number of the sons of God. However, if we look at the textual criticism of the Septuagint, we'll see that there are actually older translations into Greek that affirmed the children of Israel reading. We also see other texts of antiquity, like the Peshitta translation into Syriac, affirming the Septuagint according to the number of children of Israel. We also see the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is a textual witness to the Hebrew text, which sometimes changes the Hebrew in order to wipe Israel out of the picture. Yet even that text affirms that the purpose of establishing the borders for the nations was according to the number of Israel. So I think we're on a very good basis to say that, yeah, Israel was the reasoning behind setting up the borders. Okay, so what does that look like? Whenever God scattered the nations, he caused geological phenomenon to occur that would cause several mountains to form, which could be used as borders and boundaries to protect nations from each other. We also see, of course, rivers being formed. How many countries are there out there with a river that is used as a border for the country? And granted, sometimes rivers shift and change courses and whatnot, but there's a great strategic advantage to having a river between two countries, right? If one country tries to invade the other, now everybody has to get through water. And if you have a nice wall with a bunch of guys throwing rocks from the wall, you can sink the Navy as it tries to come over, right? So the boundaries are put there for the protection of the countries. And as a result, if we look around today, we have a whole bunch of countries, not just nations, but countries, territories with people inside and a government that preserves those people right next to each other. Okay, so the distinct countries is a divine institution. That's for the benefit of everybody on earth, believer and unbeliever alike. So Israel was put way out here in the middle. What does that have to do with anything, right? God, okay, chose this distinct nation to make them as a divine institution for the blessing of everybody. How is Israel supposed to do that? Well, the Bible tells us. So, for example, in Deuteronomy 4, God says, "Now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the judgments which I teach you to observe, that you may live." Okay, well, that's good for them. And go in and possess the land which the Lord God of your fathers is giving you. Okay, that's also good for them. Where do we come into the picture? We keep going down a little bit. And God says, "Now therefore be careful to observe them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this is a great nation. This great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us, for whatever reason we may call upon them? And what great nation is there that has such statutes and righteous judgments as are all in all this law, which I set before you this day?" And it's also interesting because he mentions that you need to teach your children, God himself relying on the institution of family for the propagation of the law. Okay, so what are we seeing here in Deuteronomy 4? God has selected Israel and he's given them laws, and they are essentially to be living by the law, show the nations around them how great God is. so that the other nations will say, wow, we want God to be near to us too. We want to study your law and put your Bible as the focus for our essential epistemological authority. And by the way, hasn't this turned out to be true even to this day? Granted, America is under some stress right now. Granted, the founding documents were not perfect, but if we look at the American founding documents, they were arranged in a way such that they honored the divine institution better than a lot of others. We had slavery. That needed to be fixed. That's a severe violation of the responsible individual. And a lot of Americans died to fix that, by the way. We can criticize that because America's a free country. But still, because America is basing its form of government off of biblical principles, America has thrived. It's been incredibly blessed throughout the years, as compared to countries that follow other worldviews based on paganism that are still struggling to this day to get electricity, right? Okay. We can go further to Deuteronomy 28, 9 through 14. The Lord will establish you as a holy people to himself, just as he has sworn to you. If you keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in his ways, then all the people of the earth shall see that you are called by the name of the Lord, and they shall be afraid of you, and the Lord will grant you plenty of goods and the fruit of your body and so forth. So God is promising prosperity to Israel, contingent on their obedience to the law. Now, God did not promise the other nations that if they follow the law, they'll be made prosperous, okay? But he also didn't promise to curse those nations should they do some of the things that are forbidden in the law. God says, and the Lord will make you the head and not the tail, okay? So that's the idea during the Mosaic law, that Israel has a law to follow, God will make them prosperous, the nations will see that, and that will draw them to God. We see this especially in the time of Solomon. He becomes incredibly wealthy. The Queen of Sheba comes to him for wisdom. He's got a great navy. I was chit-chatting with Dane, and he's got some experience in Eastern linguistics and culture, and he was really bringing up some interesting information about potential Hebrew influence on Japanese culture that continues to this day, which could be a testimony to the great navy of the days of Solomon, which would kind of make sense, right? God set up the nations in ways that Israel could be a blessing to all of them, so Israel would be able to navigate out there and be a blessing, and we see potential influences of that today. Okay, so that's kind of historical. If we turn to Isaiah 49, we see some prophecy here, right? We see how eventually Israel has fallen upon hard times today. Part of that is a result of the kingdom rejection. We'll get into that later. But eventually God will bring Jacob back to him so that Israel is gathered to him in the land. And that's when we see the Abrahamic covenant in all its fullness being poured out and established. And part of that whole entire messianic kingdom thing, a big part of that is that Israel will be as a light to the Gentiles, okay? So Israel is a divine institution. It's there for the blessing of all of humanity. Israel is to be a blessing to the Gentiles, particularly in a way that shows to the Gentiles God, our common creator. Hasn't that turned out to be true? Raise your hand if you've been blessed by Israel. Every single last one of us, right? Raise your hand if you're saved. Okay, if your hand is up right now, you have been blessed by Israel because you got saved by believing in the Israeli Messiah, Jesus, Yeshua, right? If you know right from wrong in any kind of detailed and systematic, authoritative way, you got it from the Bible, which was given to us by Israel, the Jews, right? All of the authors of the Bible were Jewish. Two potential exceptions. Some say that Luke was a Gentile. I'm not so sure. It could be that Job was written before Abraham was pulled out. That could be possible. But overall, that's a very Jewish book, the Bible is, right? Okay, so Israel is being a blessing to us, and we want to be a blessing to Israel. Now, two reasons that people would say that we don't need to necessarily be a blessing to Israel. They make the false accusation that Israel was lost in Assyria during the Assyrian and Babylonian exile. Y'all are familiar with the basic layout of the biblical narrative and how that went down. We'll take a look at that. Well, in Jeremiah 31:31, God says, "Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah." There had already been a split between the two. And here God is saying that in the future, I'm going to have a special deal with both parties. Well, for that to be true, we have to still have both Israel and Judah in the future, right? Well, some would say that, no, that's not going to happen because during the Assyrian exile, King Sargon II took all of the Israelites out, and they've been scattered abroad. We no longer have any trace of them, right? Not quite. So this is a tablet from Sargon II's annals. He was the Assyrian king who conquered the northern kingdom and led them into captivity. You can read about him in Isaiah 20. Now, in his record, he boasts of taking away 27,290 people and 50 chariots. The problem is that estimates of the population of the northern kingdom at the time ranged from 400,000 to 500,000. So there were still a lot of people left in the land. Israel remained indigenous to the land of Israel during all of this. What's more, not only did he not take everybody out, not only did he only take a minority, but during all the drama that we see in 2 Chronicles, when there was a lot of division between the northern tribes and the southern tribes, the problem was that the northern tribes were becoming distant from God at a faster rate than the southern tribes were. Eventually, the southern went into exile as well. But during all that, we see in 2 Chronicles 11 that several people from the northern tribe who were still wanting to follow God, they evaded the north and they came down to the south. So even if they slaughtered everybody in the north, the 12 tribes were still preserved in the south. By the time we get to the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, which I think originally was one volume, it's neither here nor there. But in Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7, we get lists of people that returned to the land of Israel from the Babylonian Empire. And we have a list of territories that they came from, and we have a list of names. One of the spots was a place called Azgad, which had 1,222 on Ezra's list and 2,322 on Nehemiah's list. Short version of that controversy, I think Ezra is saying how many left Babylon. Nehemiah is saying how many arrived in the land. So it seems that over 1,000 people from perhaps the tribe of Gad were in Babylon and then left. As they came along, they picked up another 1,000, a little more than 1,100, from various villages along the way that were also from Azgad, which very well could be part of the original tribe of Gad. Here's an interesting archaeological thing. So this is Pharaoh Thutmose III. He's got a temple in Karnak, Egypt, wherein he describes a lot of conquests that he did. When we read Exodus 23:28, God says to Israel before they enter the land, "I will send hornets ahead of you, so they will drive out the Hivites and the Canaanites and the Hittites before you." One interesting theory is that this is in reference to Thutmose III, who came and invaded the land of Canaan, perhaps before Israel entered the land. Part of the reason for that is that the title for the Egyptian pharaoh was Nesut Biti, which means the hornet and the hedge. representing Upper and Lower Egypt. So a hornet would have been, or a bee would have been affiliated with the Pharaoh, so that could be what God was talking about when he said that I'm going to send the bee in front of you. Make sense? Okay. Long story short, God sent Pharaoh in, and he conquered a whole lot of places. And whether or not that's affiliated with the actual Exodus event, at any rate, we do have a list of territories that Thutmose III conquered at a particular time. And we can use this to kind of trace a trail of the places that he went. Listed on there are these two territories, Ru Ten and Yu In Yu, which Ru Ten could be the biblical Lod, and Yu In Yu could be the biblical Ono. These are two territories that are listed in the list in Ezra and Nehemiah. And if we look at where they sit on Thutmose's list, they very well could have been part of the northern kingdom. If that's accurate, then that would imply that a lot of people from the northern kingdom, particularly in these three spots, Gad, Lod, and Ono, would have come down to the south. So this would be a further testimony to the preservation of the northern kingdoms. We have the Madaba map, which is a mural that was discovered, and it's got a map of Israel from a long time ago, and it's gives some information as well that very well could put some of those locations outside of Judah in the south as well. Later on, we get into Ezra, and we see that they offer 100 bullocks, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and for a sin offering for all Israel, 12 he-goats, according to the number of tribes of Israel. So Ezra and Nehemiah are writing all this stuff after the Babylonian exile, and they're speaking as if all of Israel is still there in the land. So, was Israel lost in Assyria? Absolutely not. Israel has been preserved throughout this entire drama that we see. Okie dokie. All right. Next, the big question is, did Jesus do away with Israel? Has God replaced Israel and the promises to Israel with the church? The next little bit is going to be on the topic of Russia and wokeism. And the anti-Semitism that we're seeing out of both accounts are often very much rooted in the assumption that God has done away with Israel. But we've already been here for 57 minutes and 18 seconds. So let's take a 15-minute break, and then we will return and we'll wrap up this bit about Jesus and Israel, and then we'll get into the final portion.